What is up, everybody? It's Dr. Vibe here, host and producer of the award-winning The Dr. Vibe Show. I have hosted and produced over 2,000 epic conversations over the last 10 years. And what makes our conversations epic? We don't do interviews. We do conversations. What is up, everybody? It's Dr. Vibe here, host and producer of the award-winning Dr. Vibe Show. As always, I like to say you're blessed, highly favored, a magnet for miracles, and a solution for someone's problem. And we are blessed. It's a nice day, and people are going, you're doing something live on a Saturday. Usually, Dr. Vibe, don't do that. Don't do that. But this gentleman is worth it. As always, I'd like to say Dr. Vibe Show is a home of epic conversations, and I'm the host of Epic Conversations. And we have another new friend who says he can hold a note, but he can't sing. So there's definitely a difference in that. But we've been having a lot of fun, and we were supposed to have this conversation, epic conversation, earlier on in the week. We had some technical issues. We did have some again before we started today, but we're on the ball now. Who is our friend? Dr. Jonathan Higgins. He's a speaker, educator, and thought leader. He has over 10 years experience in education, social justice, and grassroots movements. He is focused on public speaking and working with the media on issues centered on people of color, LGBT storytelling, and marginalized communities. His work has been included in Blavity, The Root, Ethnics, Wear Your Voice, and Talkspace. He serves as Campus Pride's curriculum educator and is a Lambda? Literally, yes, Lambda, I got it right. Literally writing fellow and regular contributor to Soul. He's contributed to various communities. In September 2016, he launched a YouTube channel where he posts weekly videos about race and identity issues and began sharing pieces of his mini documentary highlighting stories related to his life as a queer black man growing up in an inner city of San Bernardino, which I'm sure can have its challenges at times. The mini documentary also covers his journey to receiving his doctoral degree, and congratulations on that, by the way. And he was born in LA, graduated from California State University, San Bernardino, with a Bachelor of Arts, Communication Studies, and minor in Women's Studies. He also was a Master of Arts in Management from the University of Redlands, where he graduated top 3, another congratulations, in his class, and was introduced to the Whitehead Leadership Society. As you can tell, we can spend the whole hour just talking about what he's done, but we're going to do what he's done, what he is doing, and what he's going to do. We're so happy to have him share on a Saturday, because he said, I don't know if he's going to get mad about me saying this. This is the first day he's been at home this week on a Saturday. But his great article, Fixing the Lives of Male Childhood Rape Survivors. Dr. Higgins, thank you so much for coming on today. How you doing?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much for having me.
It is a pleasure and an honor. And I'm looking forward to this conversation because I haven't had the opportunity to discuss this important issue, especially according to men. And especially to black men over 10 years. And this is the right place and right time to discuss it. So as we like to do with new friends on the Dr. Vibe Show, can you give a little background? We've got all this education and career stuff. What was life growing up? Where did you grow up?
So I often say growing up in California has its own challenges in itself. I think I actually I spoke about this yesterday. There is this idea of what it's like to live in the golden state of California, because folks find it to be extremely progressive. We tend to make laws that protect folks who are marginalized. Our governor just declared California a safe space for those who identify as undocumented. And so I think there's this, connotation in the U.S. that if you really want to feel safe or feel comfortable, move to California. But I think that there is still a larger conversation around what it truly means to be black anywhere in the U.S. and then to be black in a place that oftentimes liberal America doesn't really see you as a full person or a full citizen, for that matter. So we still deal with race issues. There's still a ton of police brutality. I always tell the story that I was family friends with Rodney King growing up. I knew his family. I knew his kids. And so, that story back in the 90s, and then just some of the things that we've seen in certain parts of California in relation relation to the way Black folks, Black people, Black men are treated, it's still a thing. And so growing up for me, I'll just say this before we get into the conversation. Growing up for me, I'm actually writing a book right now about the interactions that I had with other Black men in my life, specifically Black family members in my life, and the pain and the frustration and the struggles that they had in dealing with the way that the world treated them and how that affected me. And so a lot of my writing, a lot of the things I speak about, a lot of the things that I am passionate about in relation to who I am and what I do, not only just as an influencer, but as somebody who works in education, I am constantly challenging folks to talk honestly. I use this metaphor, use your full voice. Because ultimately, as Black people, we're constantly silenced. And I think in spaces like education or in spaces where it's quote unquote progressive, you have folks who have privilege that take up most of the space. And so I'm really big on this notion of how do I tell my story? And while I'm telling my story, make room for other people to use their full voice in telling theirs. So that's a really big part of what I do outside of the writing, outside of the YouTube videos, and then the different things that I do when I'm asked. I'm just a very big proponent of how, like you said at the beginning, helping people become better. That's my number one goal, is when someone has an interaction with me or comes to my presentations or watches my videos or, even has a Twitter conversation with me, I want them to walk away from that conversation being better than what they were before they chatted with me. So that's just a big piece of who I am.
Excellent. Where did this passion to be that come from?
Ooh-wee. So, it was one of those things, there's maybe 2 or 3 frames of life things that, like life occurrences that happened to me that, kind of put me in this place to where I feel like I'm able to kind of do what I do. I think one of the biggest things is constantly being told by Black family members, by Black men, that I wasn't going to amount to anything. And I think a lot of this is an internalized hatred that I think Black men, not even just my family, but Black men take on, specifically this idea that they are constantly told that they are not adequate or they're not enough. And so they passed this notion down. And so it wasn't just 1 or 2 men in my family. There were multiple people in my family who said, you're not going to accomplish that. That's ridiculous. Why would you want to go for that? Whatever. And so the drive came from this notion of, if you think I'm not going to do it, watch me. And that's kind of where my whole entire life is built around that now. In a year, I've been able to accomplish way more than what I've ever been able to do. I mean, from my TEDx to writing in some of the biggest places. I just had an op-ed come out on pride.com, which was something I never thought would ever happen. I'm constantly always wanting to go. I always challenge myself to take the next step. The other big piece too is just thinking about not hearing nor seeing myself. Growing up, the only queer person, only queer Black man that I knew was RuPaul, and I don't know him. So it's like, there was a lot of things that kept me out of the light of LGBTQ, queer media, queer rhetoric as a child coming up. But I never saw anybody who looked like me and who literally loved themselves the way I love myself. And so that's been my biggest thing, is that when I walk into a room, when I walk into a space, when I'm asked to do an interview, when I'm asked to, like just this Thursday, I was asked to do a panel. Whenever I'm asked to do anything, I always walk into a room with this notion of, I love my Blackness, I love my queerness, and I love them together. Because as a community, we don't allow queer Black people to see the intersections of their lived experience and the oppression in that intersection, and be able to say, I still love myself through everything that I've been through. And so that's kind of what has drawn me to keep doing what I do, is every time I show up in my full self and in my full voice, I'm reminding other folks who look like me and who love like me that they can love themselves 110% and not have to be apologetic about it.
I love what you're sharing, and especially earlier talking about the full voice. I love that's fantastic. As you began your journey, who were some of the people who supported you along the way? Because I'm sure it's been challenging at times, but when you said, I found my voice and I want to go along that journey to live my voice, Who were
Mhm.
some of those early supporters, if any, that said, you know what, we believe in you, and because you said there were a number of people in your family and black people say, you can't do this, you can't do this. Were there people who said, you can do this, and I'm here to help you?
Yeah, well, I mean, I will always say my mom was always a big supporter in anything I've ever wanted to do. She's always known that I was smart. She would always tell me that I was a smart kid, even though at times I didn't believe it because the system was perpetuated to remind me that I wasn't meant for it, right? Education was never built for Black people, and I still believe that to this day. But I know my mom would always say, "You're very smart. You're very, you speak your mind. Keep doing that." My mom pushed me in a lot of ways, and as my mom would push me in the direction to educate myself more on topics or things that I was passionate about, I would say my eyes started to open. Critical thinking, right? I had a professor in college who challenged me to think, for myself. He said, "I don't want to know what you've been taught to think. I want to know what you think." And so having a professor who taught me to do that, and then being able to find books, I dedicated my dissertation to Bayard Rustin, thinking about, his journey and what I've read from Brother Outsider and what I also know from the film and all of the other pieces that I've picked up. I think about him, being in a movement and feeling silenced in that movement. And oftentimes feel like I'm silenced in the queer movement. And so there were a lot of parallels as I was reading and as I was researching Bayard Rustin's life that I felt like were a big piece of mine. So again, the ancestors, having my mother, having professors, but also too, I think having chosen family. I think when you come out as Black and queer and you start talking about that journey as being Black and queer, and I guess that was a big part of why I wrote the article that I wrote that got me here. I think when you're Black and queer and you start talking about your experience, there are a lot of things that folks, and I say this, it's a privilege to be able to turn a blind eye to a topic or an issue. And so specifically when the issue doesn't affect you. And so I've constantly been in this place of always being able to find friends or family or chosen family who's allowed me to talk very openly and honestly about my own journey and my own experiences with things. And I think that that's been the biggest supporter for me is not getting locked up in the people who didn't want to hear my story, finding the people that did. And I think that that's the one thing that I always challenge people to do. Don't spend time being worried about the folks who don't want to talk to you or who don't want anything to do with you. Seek out the people who are actively saying, "I love what you do," or "I love who you are. I love your full identity. I want to be there to help you heal." That's one of my biggest quotes that I say in everything. Be cautious because not everybody's interested in your healing. And I'm a really big proponent of being cautious about who I tell my story to and how I frame my story around people, because I do know that there are folks who are not truly vested in me becoming a better person. So I think that that's been a big proponent of me. It's just, you are the company you keep, and I'm very grateful to have a very strong network of great people around me.
Wow, that's fantastic. And again, I can relate to what you're saying because before we went live, Dr. Higgins asked me, like, how did you get started, this and that? And for just a mini background, I'm based in Toronto, Canada. And when I got started, I couldn't get people from Toronto or Canada to come on the show. So you had one of those moments, like Dr. Higgins just said, that either you quit or you find somebody else to hear your story who believe in your vision. And so much I can relate with. I fully understand that. Let's get to the article. And I know there's going to be a myriad of conversations just based on the article. What made you write this article at this time?
Yeah, so I'm a very big. I love. I'll wind it back. So I initially was very skeptical about Anyana, and in years past, I've watched several episodes of her season. I have tweeted out several things that she has said and things that I've seen on her show. And I've always had people say, why are you so, you're so critical about her and her work? And I go, one, I'm not a therapist, so I always like to, before I jump into this conversation, I am personally not a therapist or a psychologist. I don't have that background. But much like her, I am interested in and invested in the healing of people. And so in this story specifically, when I saw that this was going to be one of the topics for the season, there were maybe one or two things that kind of popped off in my head. I was like, ooh, let me make sure I write or say something about this before there's any preconceived notion going into part 2 of the show. One, I wanted to talk about how powerful it is that she was able to round 5 men together, 5 black queer men together, to talk about something that had transpired in their life that has framed a lot of the pain that they had. But also too, I was wanting folks to be very cautious about, and this is just, this is something I'm trying to kind of mellow out as I talk through it, being cautious that people think that queer black men are queer because they've been raped. And so that was the thing in the article, and I had prefaced it by saying, though this experience has never happened to me, the pain of being, in a way, it's, again, this is a trigger for some folks. So I want to actually say this too, like, be cautious. This can be a really big trigger. Though there was sexual violence that happened to these young men, we still need to be aware of the emotional violence that happened to these young men. And this happens, as much as it may not be sexual violence that happens to queer black men, the emotional violence that happens prior to the sexual violence is something we never talk about. And so I wanted to be very, very upfront in writing this story about not only my own journey, but letting people know that the emotional violence is partly why I do what I do. Because you have to understand that in this situation, the men that raped these young men, the men that perpetuated the sexual violence, it's based in power, but it's also based in this idea that a lot of the times the men that are doing this have not come to terms with who they are fully. And it's happened to them, or it's happened to someone that they know. And they've taken on toxic masculinity as this end-all be-all way of living their lives. And so I just felt the need to speak out and say, I want to caution black people to, because I've heard this rhetoric before, oh, he's only queer because something happened to you. And I've had people even ask me, have you ever, has someone ever touched you, or has someone ever done anything inappropriate to you? And I'm like, no. I said, my mom was really good at keeping me protected in that sense. And not to say that these young men didn't have people who cared for them or loved them and protected them. What I am saying is, ultimately, my mom, I've been very open and very honest with my mom about my journey as a queer man. And I think that that's something that we don't see in these stories, that parents are loving their children enough to ask them. My mom would ask me, what's going on with you? Even when I would have a mood change, my mom was real good at catching me and my brother's mood change and saying, come talk to me. My door's open. Did something happen to you? Or did someone do something to you that made you feel uncomfortable? And in all of these stories, that's what you hear. These young men were crying out to their parents and saying, help me, I was violated. And their parents turned a blind eye. And so that's initially what I think, kind of getting to the core of your question, why did I write this article? There was so much to unpack in just that first episode alone, about not only just the sexual violence that happens to young black men or young black queer men, but oftentimes the emotional violence that they experience after the sexual violence transpires, and how the cycle continues to keep perpetuating itself throughout their life, and how they never get to an endpoint of healing. Like, those are 5 young men who get to heal, or who have had help to get to heal, but there are thousands, if not millions, of young black men or young black queer men who will never get an opportunity to speak freely about what happened to them and what they're doing to heal themselves. So I just felt the need to say that as someone who is emotionally healing themselves from all of the wounds that my uncles and my cousins and other black men that I interacted with in college or in high school left me with. I just felt the need to say something about it, because I knew that if I didn't, nobody would.
Excellent. There's so many avenues. I'm just looking like there's all this. Okay, I'm going to start. We're just going to have a conversation here. Let's take a look at the black men who have been abused, whether in the story or in general. Mm-hmm. Let's look, and just the whole aspect of the emotional end is so deep.
Right.
And it's hard for them because, and probably one of the main reasons many blacks don't want to hear the story.
Mm-hmm.
Why are so many blacks not wanting to listen to these gentlemen's story, do you feel?
Yeah. Well, true. Well, I think there's quite a bit of pieces, and I'm praying and hoping that I'm not generalizing the experiences of Black people. I can only speak from my own lived experience, and so I want to frame it from that standpoint,
Sure.
so that way I'm not putting off my beliefs as truths and just saying from my own experience, these are the things I've experienced, and this is how I think it correlates. I know for me, growing up, religion is always the first thing, right? So Black people will hold religion higher than anything else in their life. You could tell someone that they're dying tomorrow and they'll probably say, hand me my Bible, And so I do believe religion is one of the core pieces of what, for Black people. And I think that's where a lot of it starts. But I'll also say this too. So when you go into the historical components of what it means to be Black and what it means to be Black people or part of a Black community or a Black family, pain is already like kind of there. And I know that there are a lot of folks who don't believe in epigenetics. And I know a lot of people are saying there's no research around epigenetics, so it's very hard for us to have educated or thoughtful conversations around epigenetics. And I don't know if you're familiar with epigenetics, but epigenetics is this concept.
Good. Explain it to me.
Yes, sorry.
No problem.
It's becoming a larger conversation throughout, I think, all communities of color, specifically marginalized people. But it's this notion or this belief that what happened to your ancestors and what happened to your grandparents and what happened to your parents is passed down to you through genetics. And so I had even, before I had done my TED Talk, I was going to do my TED Talk around epigenetics and thinking about my mom. My mom is a very, well, at least she was. When we were growing up, I don't want to say she is now because people change. But growing up, when I was a child, my mom was a very nervous person. And I recognized that my grandfather was also a very nervous person. And so I started recognizing the different ways as I was getting older that I had taken on these traits of always being nervous, always being fearful, always being worried about something. And I started thinking about it from the standpoint of like, this has to be, through some sort of genetic ways or because of, my mom being so worried about me during her pregnancy. My mom almost lost me. That was passed down to me. And so, again, epigenetics is that thought process that whatever, there's been studies that have been done. I'll frame it from the studies and then I'll move on from my point. The studies that have been done, and there's not a lot, but the one that sticks out the most is a study that was done with rats and the cherry blossoms. And so what they had done with the rats was they had taken a set of rats and they basically made them fearful of the cherry blossoms. And literally anytime they would see them or they would smell them, the rats would just go into a fury of fear. And they ended up getting one of the rats pregnant, or impregnating one of the rats. And ultimately what they did was, after the babies of the rats were old enough to actually see and move around, they set the cherry blossom in front of the babies, and the babies had the same exact reaction. And so it's one of those things where they're trying to prove that a lot of the tension, a lot of the heart problems, a lot of the things that we have that happen to us as Black people, because people say, why do Black people die from heart failure? Why is it such a big deal? Because there are studies that show that Black people die from heart failure more than any other race. I think folks are trying to put the pieces together and trying to say the history around Black people is what causes folks to have heart failure, because we have such a large, we carry so much stress in our bodies, not only from the historical standpoint, but just from living in a world that wasn't built for us. And so kind of going back to this whole piece around me and my own lived experience and why it's so salient for me to talk about this issue. I know that for me growing up, I never, outside of my mom, my family, when we would try to talk about family issues, no one would ever want to have those conversations. And it was always very much kind of oh, that happened in the past. Let's move on. Everything's fine now. And I just, no one ever talked about going to therapy. No one, my mom would talk openly and honestly with me about her bout with, mental illness and depression, and telling me to be cautious about it. And she still does. She's like, you're almost 35. I started having mental issues and things around that time. So please make sure you're taking care of yourself. My mom has always been very open and honest with me about mental health, about my emotional health, about my sexual wellness, all these different pieces. And I don't find that other Black people, when I have conversations with them, they don't have these conversations because their families are Christian, or their families are Jehovah's Witnesses, or their families are, I forget, Kojic or COGIC. I know the Church of God in Christ,
Yep.
like folks are Baptists. There are all these pieces that folks in Black families, they basically try to throw the veil over things because it just makes it easier for them to turn away from them than to actually address them. But we've never been given the tools to be able to have the conversations that we need to have around how do we heal as a family when something like this happens. And so I think for me, I will say this again, because the situation did not happen to me, I'm blessed to have a mother who was in my corner enough to be able to say, if it did happen, she had the tools to be able to have the conversation. But my mom made the tools available to herself. And so I struggle a lot when I start talking to other Black queer men specifically around how Black men are taught to talk about their pain, right, how Black men are taught to internalize their pain, and oftentimes how Black men are taught to contextualize the situation around where that pain stems from. I think it's a real issue.
Do you feel it's been an issue for hundreds of years? Because it seems that this is a never-ending a cycle that is handed down.
Yeah. Specifically with sexual violence, I think rape culture as a whole has always been around, and we have to challenge where rape culture started. Rape culture, in my opinion, and again, this is just me and my thinking and what I know and what I've seen. When you think about the way that slave owners raped Black men, the way that slave owners raped Black women, the way that white men specifically came in and colonized Native American land and raped the women there, did things to sterilize them, and then utilized sex as a way, or relations. I don't want to call it, any other than that. They used relations as a way to hold power over Native people. We have to get back to the history, and that's the biggest thing with me, right? It's easy for me to say let's go back to the history because I have the privilege to say I have education, I have access to a computer, I have access to libraries to read up on all of these things. Not all Black people have that access. So I want to make sure that I'm not kind of influencing my privilege around that. I want to acknowledge the privilege that's around that conversation. But what I will say is the reason why I feel like it goes back for years and years and years is, again, connected back to that fear around who holds the power when these type of things happen. And it's very interesting to me that it goes, again, it has to go back to slavery, because that's, in my opinion, where a lot of it started. When we started giving white men, specifically the ones who were in positions to call themselves slave owners or slave masters, there's a power dynamic there. And the men in those positions use that power dynamic to control the people, to get them to do what they wanted them to do. So in order for a Black man to not get raped, he would do things that he probably did not want to do. And I think that that's the biggest thing, is when we get to the core of rape, when we get to the core of rape culture, it's this idea that folks are using their maleness, or they're using their male, the identity of what they've built around the binary, right? The binary piece of what it means to be a man in this world. They're using that as a power to basically take over somebody else's being or lived experience or their power. I struggle with this notion, and again, this is just me, that a lot of the men who do rape young Black men are struggling with their own sexual identities. And I think we have to get to the core around how Black people don't want to address that. Because if again, they do say that there is, and again, there are studies that show that this is something that's passed down from top down to the bottom, right? So, someone, one man's father did it to him, so he now does it to a child, and the child will do it to someone else, because again, the cycle doesn't allow them to heal. But what I will say is that there are two pieces that are there. There's a power dynamic that Black men are struggling to have when we talk about rape culture and them raping young men or other young men, or even raping women, but then also the struggle of one's own sexual identity and not being able to contend with and not being able to emotionally heal from what happened to them in the first place that got them to that space. So it's just, again, it's a cycle of pain. I genuinely believe that all of this, it's not just about the cycle of rape. It's not the cycle of, it's a cycle of emotional bruising that continues to be passed down from top to bottom that no one is wanting to address.
It's a true point. One of the things I remember hearing many years ago is hurting people hurt people.
Yep, hurt people hurt people.
Absolutely. I want to throw the whole aspect of toxic masculinity into this, because it's a term that I've heard for a number of years doing these conversations. What is your definition of it, and where did it fit in the article that you wrote, and maybe in the program, because it sounds like it wasn't really addressed fully in the program, and you addressed it in your article.
Yeah. So what I did was, while I wrote the article, I went back and I looked up, concepts related to rape culture. And like I said, I don't think that there have been enough. I don't think that there has been enough conversation around going to the root of rape culture and how it started, again, with, slavery and with the colonization of Native American people. But what I will say, that toxic masculinity starts to show up in different ways, specifically in the ways that Black men interact with each other. And I find it to be so interesting that when men are not comfortable with who they are, specifically Black men, I get this more from Black men than anybody. This idea how other men who are not comfortable with who they are or their own journey, how they interact with me as a man who is very comfortable with who he is. And then this idea too of the proponent of, I have to be extra, or I have to be more in order for people to love me or like me. I think that that's a very strong proponent of toxic masculinity. It's this idea that you always have to be in control. You always have to have power. You always have to have, you basically can have whatever you want. But what's so interesting, and where a lot of this came from, I don't know if you've seen the film, The Mask You Live In. It's on Netflix. It's a film, and it talks about masculinity as a whole, but there are onuses and points of toxic, that they talk about toxic masculinity. Toxic masculinity, and the root of it really starts with this idea that men are not, they're not taught how to manage their emotions. They're not taught how to manage the way that they feel. And so it's so interesting, that, there are men in my life that I know personally that identify as straight Black men, and they will walk in and give me a hug, a kiss on the cheek. We can have really deep emotional conversations. I can rest my head on their shoulder, and there's no onus of it being sexualized, right? It's me. It's, this gentleman he's a close friend of mine. And I love him, and I love being I love being around him. I love his energy. His energy makes me whole. We are taught that that's bad in Black culture, specifically between Black men. So you have a lot of Black men who are not, they have not been touched in the right way, right? They don't know how to give hugs. They don't know how to emotionally, in terms of touch, connect with one another, even with their partners. So you have some straight cis men saying their wives are asking them to open up and to be more vulnerable with them, and they don't know how. That's a proponent of toxic masculinity. This idea that your emotions, don't cry. You're not supposed to cry. Real men don't cry. And in my book, I talk about that. The first time that somebody in my family told me, be a man, you're not supposed to be crying, women only do that. And so how in toxic masculinity, everything that we're told not to do is equated to being a woman. and even how in Black culture women are, it's almost like we hate women in a sense, right? It's like this idea that when we get to the core of what toxic masculinity is, it's the idea that we hate women. And so anything that a man does that is equated with being a woman or antiquated with being a woman, we're now looking at that as you don't take that on, and how much pain that's creating within the energy and within the psyche and the emotional being of a Black man. And so I always go back to this notion of with toxic masculinity, there's 2 points. There's either one, I'm going to be in a position of power and I'm going to maintain that power and I'm going to do whatever I have to do to maintain that power because that's the only thing I know how to do. Or there's the latter where men are so disconnected from themselves that they can't open up, they can't talk, they just don't know how to. Basically, they don't know how to be a man in that sense, quote unquote. They don't know how to be a man because there's so many mixed signals about what it means to be a man in our lived experience, and no one has put together a true kind of packet per se of what it is to truly be a man that doesn't include hurting women, harming women, or doing anything that could potentially cause harm upon a woman or a man who has feminine or effeminate features. Does that all make sense?
It does. And one of the things I want to ask you about, you had mentioned the difference between a man who has a sense of himself, how he dresses you, versus a man who doesn't have sense of self. Mm-hmm. And could you give an example of that? Because I find that very interesting, and I think our audience would benefit on how you can tell if a man has a sense of self and doesn't have that toxicity in his life.
Yeah. So again, the way, so I've walked in, so for instance, I think about me and just kind of who I am and the way I live my life. I kind of just go, I kind of just do what I need to do. There have been moments I've walked in. So thinking about so I've heard one of my friends who, a Black queer man, he had noted he calls it barbershop culture. And the way that men talk about things or about people or how they interact with one another in the barbershop. And how even for him as a queer Black man, how he had to stop going to said barbershop because of the things that they were saying about queer people or the way that they made him feel as a queer Black man in that space. Right. And so it's a culture that's perpetuated for a lot of Black men. Specifically men who are not comfortable with themselves or with, I've had queer Black men, he's gay, that's gross, and it's kind of like, I didn't even say anything to you. Like, I didn't look at you. So for you to see me and then for you to now start making comments about my own sexual identity or about who I am as a queer Black man, that tells me that something is, not necessarily, I don't want to go and say, oh yeah, well you must be queer too. No, but the fact that you saw me and it made you uncomfortable.
Right.
That for me says a lot. And so because I walk past Black men and they just like, hey, what's up, man? I'm like, hey, how you doing? And I keep it pushing and they keep it pushing. And it's a very easy, it was just a very easy interaction. Or hey, I see you, you see me, have a nice day. But for you to go out of your way to now have to make a comment about my sexual identity without you even really knowing me says a lot about you and what you think about yourself. And so that's why I say I think it's a very important issue for us to talk about the way that Black men see themselves and the way that Black men talk about their own identities. Because oftentimes when Black men do see someone like myself, they've been taught to hate that or they've been taught to fear that.
A seed has been planted.
Right. And so because they fear that they might be who I am or they may be affiliated with me in some type of way, they're now taught to utilize hatred in regards to acknowledging it. So yeah, it's like I said, it's a cycle, and I think it continues to be perpetuated in so many different ways. But I'm just happy that different spaces are now starting to address that.
In light of what you just said there, and one of the many powerful statements you make in your article is, quote, we must stop thinking that the acts that happen to our young Black men are somehow their fault and start holding the adults, yes, the grown-ass men who are committing these crimes, accountable.
Yes.
Can you expand on that, and why aren't they being held accountable, and what do we need to do to make them accountable?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the first thing I'm not going to say is call the police and send them to jail. I am a very strong proponent and believer that policing as a whole is a bigger problem in our community as well. But I do believe that there are ways that we can hold these men accountable. I think by addressing it from a legal standpoint. I also think that there are folks who specialize in terms of therapy who can tell family, this is the way you can get your child help. This is the way that you can get yourself help as you're helping your child through this. There are multiple avenues to address this. And again, because I am not a professional around sexual violence, I can't say per se, these are the things that I think that Black families and Black people should do. What I will say, though, is that acknowledging the voice of the child is the most important. Acknowledging the voice of the young Black man who is saying, I was violated, is most important. And I do believe that I think that parents need to start, and that's why I said that, in terms of holding other folks accountable. If legal action means, police and all of that other things, yes, you broke the law. You did something that you violated someone. You have to think about it from that context. Yes, if you do something wrong, something else is going to happen. Every action has a reaction. But my biggest thing, what I come down to is this idea of how do we begin to start validating the healing process of the young man. And I think that's the most important thing. When a parent can actively start saying, I'm going to take what you said seriously, I'm going to address said person, instead of just ignoring it, I'm going to address said person and say, I believe my child over you, and now we're going to get this investigated so that way we can find out what truly happened. That, for me, changes the way that the young Black man sees themselves throughout their life. They're now being able to say, my parent loved me enough to believe me, that my parent believed me enough to say, I'm going to do what I need to do to get this rectified, regardless of if it's legal or if it's not. And to see that their parent addressed the older parent about it. When we start putting the voices of adults over our children, I think that's where we start this whole kind of cycle of invalidating people as humans. And I think it starts at being a child. A lot of the men in that episode said, when I went to my parent and I told them, they didn't believe me.
Right.
And I think that's the first part of their life where they're starting to recognize, wow, like nobody validates me, nobody loves me, nobody cares about what I have to say. So I'm not going to say anything at all. And so I think that's the biggest thing, the biggest proponent. Yes, if legal pieces come into play, we have to go down that road when we get there. But I think just by the parent believing the child enough to say, I'm going to address this person and say, why would my child even say this? You know what I mean? Like if my child is 5 or 6 and they don't know about that, why would my child come to me and say and blame you, and say that you did this to them? So I need you to help me understand why that transpired. And I think that's the biggest thing for me in regards to that. We just need to start validating our children's voice much more than what we do.
Now, you did mention that you see a change coming, but I think this change will take a long time. This is just my opinion, because some of these thoughts, some of these behaviors have been ingrained for many, 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 many years. Mm-hmm. And of course, as always say, the hardest thing is to change, but I think it's even hard to change yourself emotionally. And then on top of it, people inside have to take some personal accountability on themselves. Is that a lot to ask for?
No, I mean, we hold folks accountable in so many different capacities. And I think that it just becomes this idea of we need to stop. We need to, I always say this too, the personal is political. And I think that this whole piece around us as Black people and the ways that our voices are invalidated, this is just a small piece of the larger way that the system works to keep us as not full people. And so I do believe that when we start telling Black people to do the work to heal themselves, and it's not always putting the work back on them. I'm very cautious of that too, and framing a lot of the stuff that I frame, that sometimes it's not about you, it's about telling other people to do their work too, so that way it can make your life a little bit easier. I am a very big proponent of that even in my own life, and I talk very openly and honestly about that. There are a lot of things that my mother has contended with throughout her life. And I've told her on several occasions, you need to go do your work on that before you come over here into my life and start wanting to kind of stir up stuff. And so I think, it's not, I don't believe it's too much to ask to tell people, let's end this process, let's end this cycle, let's start healing our young men, let's start healing our young women, let's start healing our young people. Because I think what ends up happening is, like you said, going back to that point about hurt people, if we don't focus on the idea of where does this hurt start, where's the root of it, we're never as people going to heal.
Right.
And so I think that it's a really big topic. Yeah. And again, it's a very large topic that I think a lot of Black people are not having enough of. But what I will say per se in all of this is that healing is the most important thing, and the only time that a person can really start to heal is when they can start to acknowledge their pain. And so we need to start holding our parents accountable about how they hold others accountable about the pain that's caused to their child when their child's innocence is lost. We need to start holding ourselves accountable for doing our own research around how we can heal ourselves from things that have happened to us, so that way it's not passed down. And ultimately, how we can all work collectively together to heal a community of Black people that continue to be hurt every single day.
How big of an issue is Black men who have been sexually abused, in your opinion? Because we don't hear about it a lot. Mm-hmm. Is it a bigger issue than most of us think it is?
I do. I truly believe that it is a much bigger issue. I will say this, working in higher education and working with young men, specifically young Black men, in different capacities, whether it was, different groups that I've sat in on, or different healing circles, or different conversations on what it means to be a Black queer man. There is a lot of hurt around that conversation that comes up. And you'll find that someone will raise their hand and say, this happened to me when I was, 5. This happened to me when I was 7 or 8. This happened to me in college. I was raped. I do believe that because we are taught, this is the thing, as Black people, we're taught to be strong. At all costs. We're taught to just be strong people, period. Because our ancestors, the people above us, our family, grandparents, uncles, aunts, mothers, whatever, they know the cost of what it means to be Black. And so we're taught to be strong. And so that means oftentimes putting aside the pain that happens to you in situations like this. And so I find that the reason why we're not having these conversations is because Black individuals, specifically Black men, are moving and utilizing that notion or that concept of being strong as a way for them to kind of rid the need to heal from what happened to them. And when we can get folks to understand that being strong doesn't mean that you're not weak, or not, you know what I mean? Like, it doesn't mean you not talking about this doesn't make you weak. Or you talking about this doesn't make you weak. It just means that you are a person who really wants to do the work to heal yourself. And I think that that's what we need to kind of change the rhetoric around. There are a lot of people walking around here going, I'm strong. I ain't weak. I know, I know bitch ass nigga. That's what I hear a lot of. I know bitch ass. And it's okay. You can say that, but it's still okay for you to have connections to your emotions. It's still okay for you to address the things that have happened to you in your life. It's okay for you to let that go and for you to start the process of healing in your life. So I want to get away. I think we need to start talking to Black men about what it means to be strong and not equating that ideal or that concept to being weak. Because at the end of the day, when we start talking about healing, you have to go to an emotional place to do that. And I don't think that we're teaching Black men specifically how to do that in a way that's conducive to their own psyche.
Excellent. What's the reaction to the article been like?
So one of the things that my manager often tells me is to not read the comments.
Okay, I hear that by a lot of people. No problem.
So I'll be honest. I kind of always just kind of like I'll post an article and walk away from it, okay. Or I'll pitch an article, I'll write it, and once they post it, I just kind of leave it where it is. Yep. Overall, though, I have had when I do when I do write articles about identity and issues that connect to identity, I usually always have a very positive response. The few comments that I did glance at right as the article was posted was like, "Woo, this is heavy. I'm so glad someone finally said something about it." I've had folks, say thank you for writing this article because it cleared up a lot of stuff that I was thinking while I was watching it. So I will say I have not gotten. There have been articles that I have written where I've gotten a very negative response, and people have actually went and emailed me on a personal level and said, "Hey, this is what I think." So the fact that I didn't get emails, the fact that I didn't get tweets or I didn't get trolled on Twitter, says a lot to me that I either think people highly resonated with the article or that people found the article to be timely and necessary for their own healing.
I consider you a voice for this community. When I don't know if have you had the experience to speak to a black man or black men who have been sexually abused? Have you had that opportunity?
No, I mean, and that's the thing too that I find to be very interesting. A lot of black men struggle with bringing me into their spaces. Wow. And I just find it to be very interesting that I don't get, I get a lot of universities, I get a lot of people who, I think it would be great for you to connect with my students or connect with us about, when I'm talking about social justice, equality, equity, all these different things. But it's very rare that I get a group of black men saying, "Hey, you should come and talk to black men about loving yourself and loving who you are." And again, I think it's because it's this notion that black men struggle with seeing queerness as quote unquote, from a standpoint of religion. Oh, I don't agree with that. And it's like, okay, well, you may not agree with it, but black men are still queer. So, it happens. But I just think that, go ahead.
What is your community wanting to see from black men who are not queer?
I get that. I think that's the sole purpose of my book. I think I'm just ready for black men to start doing their work. Honestly, I think.
And what does that look like? What does that work look like to you?
Yeah, well, it's just, everything in my TED Talk is based around this idea of unlearning. I say you spend your whole entire life learning. You go to school, you have your parents telling you things, you have your friends telling you things, you have all these different things that you take on as truths. And like my professor asked me, I think that's what's got me here. When my professor stopped me and said, "What do you believe?" He said, "Jonathan, what do you believe? I don't care what your mom believes. I don't care what your religion believes. I don't care what anyone else believes. What do you believe?" And when we challenge black men to start doing that, because black men, "Oh, I don't agree with that. I don't agree with this. Or this is how she like. This is what it means to be a man." And it's like, okay, doing your work requires you to unlearn a lot of the stuff that you might see or you may know is problematic, but you just subscribe to it because it's comfortable. And I think that that's what it really means for me in terms of definitely doing your work. It's when you can actively take a step back and go, "Wait a second. What do I believe? And is that the right thing to believe? Because I don't know how I feel about that." I think that that's a big proponent of what it means to do your own work.
Mm. And we are in a culture now where unlearning and diversity and demolishing old thoughts is so rampant, and it seems that there's still a lot of things that a number of black men just don't want to let go of.
Right. But there's also this concept too, if they don't want to let it go because it still provides them one leg up. So it's just this, because we are a community of people who don't have access to power and privilege all the time. When you can focus on the queer community more than focusing on the issues in the black community, what does it do? It offers you this idea to feel like you're a little bit more superior than someone else's group. And so it's just this notion too of, like my mom would always say, "Stay out of my kitchen unless you want to help me clean it." And I think a lot of people do that. A lot of people look into other people's kitchens because they're not concerned with washing their own dishes. They're not concerned with cleaning their own floors. And so as black people, we've taken that on as a way for us to feel better about the experiences and the journeys that we have. But I tell people all of the time, I'm not worried about what you're doing over there. 9 times out of 10, my day is not wrapped up in what other people are doing. I am always concerned about what is Jonathan's next move? What is Dr. Higgins' next move? What is Dr. John Paul going to be doing in the next couple of days? And what is he doing to become a better person? That's all I'm ever concerned about. Because I think if we don't get to this piece where we start holding other Black people accountable for being so caught up in other people's business, then we're never going to be a community of people that heal. We're always going to be so concerned about being better than someone else or leveling up someone else, and we're ultimately going to keep perpetuating the same cycle of pain that's created by doing exactly what we do. So,
with the Ms. Van Zant's episode, did it bring anything to light to you that you did not know, or was it things that you knew already, but at least they were on a wider platform?
Yeah. There was one in particular gentleman, and I don't know the name verbatim. He was talking about his military experience. And as he was talking about it, I could hear it was almost like I went back to my 21, 22-year-old self.
Right.
And I could hear the pain in his voice. I could see the pain in his tears, the way that he interacted with Anyanla and a few of the other men in the space. I could see that. And I think it's important to note that there are a lot of Black queer men, specifically Black queer men, who are hurting, and people just see their hurting as anger or as frustration or as this. And I'm going, no, I think when I was looking at them, and as I'm looking at and hearing what they're sharing, I'm going, oh my gosh, I can see exactly why so-and-so is the way that they are, because they've probably gone through the same thing. They've shared that piece with me, so they don't know, they just don't have the words of how to explain how they feel. They're just locked in anger because they're so upset that it happened to them. And I think that that's the thing we need to get away from is, shaming Black men for being angry or shaming Black women specifically for being angry. It's like, yes, they have a right to be upset that an injustice happened to them. I mean, you walk out your door every day and injustice has happened to you just as a Black person alone. So now to have to carry this bag of everything that happened to you as a child and not have the words to explain how it affects you, it's got to be painful. Yeah. And like I said, when I started my healing process, I became a lot less angry because I started finding the words to be able to call out what was happening to me. But I think that's been the biggest thing for me by watching that episode, is by looking at this idea of what does being silenced truly look like. And I think that for me, when I was watching all 5 of those men interact with each other, when I was specifically looking at the young man talking about his experience with the military, these were all young men who were silenced in some type of way, and how that violent act really just took over their lives, and how that happens to people day in and day out. Yeah.
I think one of the things that's resonating in my mind right now is accepting people where they're at.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes,
it's a very, very. That's what's resonating in my mind of what you just said. Accept people where they're at, because we discussed this before we came on live, that we all need help.
Yeah, we do. And I think it's important for us to also to note this too. Yeah. So this person that oftentimes that people see in front of them, you have the social media person, you have the speaker, you have the writer, you have this queer advocate, this queer Black LGBTQ. This is a lot of work I've done, but it's also been a lot of therapy. And that's what I've also been telling people too. Go see a counselor. Yes. We as Black people don't talk about therapy enough. We don't talk about what it means to be spiritually well. Yes, religion is important for some people. I get that. But there's a vast difference between having religious information and being spiritually well. And I challenge people on so many accords, make sure that you are well overall. And so I think that's the biggest thing too that I took away from that episode, is why it's so important for us to encourage people to go seek out therapy, to go seek out counseling. Here in America, yes, the medical system is trash. We have a lot of problems with a lot of issues here in terms of getting access to care in so many different spectrums. But I'm thinking about it from the proponent of, if you work at a business and they are offering you Medicaid, they're offering you Medi-Cal, Medicare, Medicaid, whatever, ACA, or anything, if you have access to being able to go sit in somebody's chair and your copay is only $15, there is no reason why you shouldn't be using it, specifically if you are a Black person. And I truly believe that.
True. Now that's a very important point, because we all got stuff going on, and it's not a sign of weakness to ask for help. It's a sign of strength.
Yes.
And I encourage Black men who are watching this live or on the replay, and those who love them, let's accept Black queer men where they are. Where they are, because the more people you can deal with and relate with, the better person you'll become.
Yep. So true.
You know, so I know that I don't want to take up too much of time on your only free day this week. Any final comments you'd like to make about the article, about with this subject, any calls to action you may have for our listeners, our viewers, sorry?
Yeah. I think the one thing I would say is just be aware of how we listen to people's narratives, what we take away from people's narratives. I'm a very big proponent of I don't speak to just speak. I speak to be heard, and I expect the same thing from other people. When people talk to me, I'm not just listening to them. I'm really trying to put together a synopsis in my head of what they're really trying to say to me. And so I'm really a big proponent of that. I would challenge parents, Black parents, please stop gaslighting your children. Stop telling them that what's happening to them is a figment of their imagination or that it didn't happen. Listen to your kids. If that's the one thing that, even with the jacked up life that I had in so many different ways, the one best thing that I had was a mother who did genuinely listen to me and who said, I want to know what's going on. Be aware of the people that you keep around you and your children. And specifically even thinking about, you know, again, going back to that care notion, really, really allow yourself, if you are an adult and you are an older Black man, or you are an older queer Black man, there's nothing wrong with ultimately speaking out and saying, I want to tell my story. I need to get my story told. I want to tell it the way I want to tell it. I think it's important that we start documenting these kind of things in the different ways that Black men are healing, so that way it doesn't become a white cisgender way of, because again, it's very easy to say too that telling someone to go get some, to go get help, to go get therapy is a very white cisgender thing to do. I want to be cautious of that. I'll just say for me, that helped me. But what I'm saying is I think it's important for us to start documenting these narratives and explaining what's happening in these narratives, so that way other folks have access to resources to say, I didn't really like therapy, so I want to see what this person did to heal themselves, and being able to have that at an arm's reach. So that's my last takeaway. Really, just we need to get these stories out. I can't be the one to keep writing on it, because again, it's not my lived experience. But I am encouraging other people to do that, to tell their stories, so that way folks like me who are interested in the healing of Black queer men can continue to say, I pulled from this resource, and this is my advice and ways for us to be able to heal all Black people who experience sexual violence.
Excellent. And I'll just piggyback on what Dr. Higgins is saying. Document, control your narrative. Please do that. That's so important. And a small thing I do, if you really care about someone, wherever they are in their journey, it doesn't have to be a big thing. One of the things I do with a lot of people, and I use my phone to do it, I'll just text people and say, you good? Simple.
Oh, yes.
Because just those little things, believe me, I've experienced in my own life and other people's lives. Sometimes you could be having a terrible moment, and it gives you the energy just to go on. So whether it's a Black queer man, whether it's anybody, it's simple. It's not complicated, and it can mean so much.
Really can.
Yeah. Dr. Higgins, again, thank you for taking the time on your few moments of relaxation to share with us. If people want to get in touch with you, how can they do that?
So I'm a big proponent of social media. You can find me on all channels of social media, specifically Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. Twitter is where I'm most active. I am one of those folks who are verified, but I do talk back to people. So yes, so I know some people, once they see that blue check, they go, "Oh, he doesn't talk back," and I'm actually like, "Yes, I actually have full-blown conversations about topics and ideas with people about things." So if you are interested, please find me on all of my handles. You can find me at Dr. John Paul. You do have to spell doctor out. It's Dr. Doctor JONPAUL. You can also visit my website at www.drjohnpaul.com. There are links to reading all of my older articles that I've written and published. There's also a link to read my dissertation if you're interested in learning more about the research that I've done. And then there's also other ways. There are also other resources on my website, specifically my videos and links to other care articles in order for folks to basically just, if you need resources, you need help, visit my website. I have all of that there, and I'd be happy to connect with you.
Great. What's next for you? What's up next? I know you told me beforehand you're on your way. You're traveling. What's up next for you?
Yeah, so what is up next for me? The next couple of weeks. This week is actually a down week. I'm going to be spending the week kind of just bouncing in and out with meetings with managers and finishing up articles that are due to different spaces. But ultimately, the following week, I will be traveling out to Louisville, Kentucky. I'll be doing some work with the University of Louisville around both how to work with LGBTQ students, some resistance grassroots work, and then I also have a podcast that's coming up with Strange Fruit. So
nice.
If you are interested in just following, again, nice. I'll be promoting all of that on my social media. Sure. If you're interested in hearing more of me or getting more of my opinion on things and different topics in relation to my intersectional existence, yeah, feel free to follow me on social media and you'll find more about where I am and what I'm doing. You can also check my website too. It is updated regularly about where I am and where I'm going and who I will be working with. So.
Excellent. Well, that is fantastic. It's Dr. Vibe here, host and producer of the award-winning The Dr. Vibe Show. If you want to catch replays of my epic conversations audio-wise, you can go to my website. You can go to Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, TuneIn Radio, Google Play Music Store, and Stitcher Radio. You can catch selected audio replays at thegoodmanproject.com and also at WJMS Radio. You can catch replays of my YouTube conversations right here. Also realize that I am a certified empowerment coach and president and CEO of Express Your Vibe Coaching Communications. And if you'd like a complimentary 30-minute session, please reach out to me at Twitter at drvibeshow, email dr.vibe at the drvibeshow.com. You can also fill out the contact form on my website, or you can also just find me out, really and truly. I'm not as prolific on social media. I don't have thousands of followers yet, like Dr. John, but maybe one day. Also, I'm a brand ambassador for the only African-American magazine dedicated to African Americans in food, wine, and travel, Cuisine Noir magazine. And that's it. That's all. So as always, I like to say three things before we let go. First of all, live your life as a dream. If you can dream it, you can make it. Also, sometimes you have to get smaller to get stronger. And finally, God bless, peace be well, keep the faith, and bye-bye. Thanks for watching live and on the replay, and we will have Dr. John Paul back when he has a moment to breathe. Thanks so much for watching, and have an outstanding day. Bye-bye.
Great. Have a great day.
What is up, everybody? It's Dr. Vibe here, host and producer of the award-winning The Dr. Vibe Show. I have hosted and produced over 2,000 epic conversations over the last 10 years. And what makes our conversations epic? We don't do interviews. We do conversations.